So welcome everyone. This is our fourth webinar on managing a nonprofit during a crisis period and hyperchange. Today we're going to focus on balancing your financial health with your mission and managing operating reserves. And I'm hoping we will also get to communicating about it. I'm not going to introduce Michael because you guys have all met with him several times, but as you know, he's a very experienced nonprofit CPA who's done a lot of training on accounting and who's been thinking really deeply about how to manage this crisis, which honestly, the deeper we get into it, the more clear it is that it isn't even a normal crisis. It's not like the recession of 2007 or other crises that you've managed a nonprofit in. And so today we're gonna really talk about kind of sustainability and looking forward and thinking that through. So Michael, I'm gonna turn it over now to you. Oh, before I do that, two things. One is Polani just emailed you all the slides that Michael is working with. They'll be up on your screen too, but if you wanna pull them down and look at them instead so you can go back and forth, you're certainly free to do that. So that was one thing I wanted to say. And the other is a reminder that these webinars are intimate enough that we really do keep them interactive. So be prepared to unmute yourself and to comment, or if you can't mute yourself, put things in the chat box. I monitor the chat box and I share the comments. Because we're recording these, if you've got comments in the chat box, I may read them out loud so that people who watch the webinar later know what they are, particularly if you have questions. So with that, I will now turn it over to Michael.
Okay, thank you very much, Deb. Can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure.
Yep,
it's good. Okay, great. Good to be back. I'm going to just go by the introductions. This is the fourth part. Do want to remind people again today that the website SC4 Nonprofits down here has new content since we last talked. We posted two new pieces this week alone, and encourage you to go there. And some of the things we're talking about here today, there's some great resources and articles related to it. So with that said, we have 4 parts here today. Deb, this is a little bit ambitious, but we're gonna try to get through each part. Also, the slide content is a little heavier this time because it's really there to have as a resource going forward. I would encourage everybody to put the 4 slide decks together. And I think you'll see that it'll provide a resource for you to use over the next many months. Part 1, we're going to be talking about balancing mission and financial resources and how we're temporarily pivoted. And we've referred to this a little bit before, but I want to go into this and talk about messaging. With all of these 4 parts, messaging is key. We're going to talk, this is the key section here today, part 2. We'll spend the most time here using operating reserves. We will have some case studies here I want to walk through. No 2 organizations do this the same, and I think it'll be really good. And there's 3 case studies like bigger, middle, and small, one very healthy, one not very healthy. And so I think it'll help perk your attention a little bit. So I want to definitely save time for that. Part 3, we're going to look at restricted funds and some options that we might have there. Restricted funds, of course, there are no option if there's, a donor restricted or grant restricted, but there are some things in managing I want to go through, and I want to go through a checklist on that and a couple of examples. And then we're going to finish. Deb, I'm not sure about how much time we'll have for this one, but this has been an important topic for me because we're coming up on June 30th, which it's now past us. And everybody's in the process of closing the books. Lots of organizations, including some of the ones on this call today, have June 30 year ends. And and if you're a 12/31 or 9/30 year end, I want to think about this. It's the first time we're starting to think about crisis and the end of the year, and I want to give you some strategies and some things that I've been doing with clients over the last couple of weeks. Okay. So let's get going. Deb, you'll monitor the chat room. I encourage, you can even just turn your mic back on and just blur it out if you would like as we go through questions and things, and I'm going to be asking you some questions. So first part is balancing mission and financial health, and definitely want you to jump in on this. So here's what we got. I've already given you this answer. So, but I want to talk you through some thinking points on this. In the short run, it's always about mission. But in the short run, we have to protect our financial position, because if we weaken ourselves, you've heard me talk about this on almost every one, that, and we can't do mission in the future, we're not going to help anybody down the road. So in the short run, protecting our current financial position is more important. It hurts my heart, but we have to go into this direction. Okay, so we're going to make long-term mission delivery is why we're here. If you can help give an organization of 5, 10, 20 years of financial health, you're going to do a lot of mission. But if you hurt your survivability in the short run, you won't get to the long run. Okay. And as we've talked about in the other ones, even when we first met, Deb, remember, I still believe today, which we were having a nice heart-to-heart discussion, 4 or 5 months into this, I'm not sure where we're going yet. And so the biggest risk right now, and the longer this drags out, this risk gets larger. Because if we could rebound quicker, that our financial position, you've heard me say, the short of running somebody over with a truck right now, the place we're going to get in trouble the quickest is getting in a financial bind. And so we really got to protect that position, as we're talking about. I do want to give you the facts of life here. And these are my facts of life. Fact of life number 1 is the demand was always bigger than the need. There isn't enough money on the planet to fix poverty, to fix climate change, fix, what I mean? That doesn't discourage us. It just means we keep fighting every day to do things. So we can't use that during a crisis. Demand actually oftentimes goes up. Not for all groups, but oftentimes goes up. People need us even more. Okay? But we can't love them so much that we disappear. And so we have to balance this. And it's sometimes we have to say no. And I want to talk about this because I want to talk about it in the case of, I think it's a messaging drill also. So it's never easy, but we have to preserve our mission. I'm getting a little redundant here. A couple of planning trips, okay? Anticipate this question. Deb, you brought up a really good point, and I'd like you to comment on this. We're messaging through many lenses all the time, right? How many times have I called you late at night and said, oh, we got a problem, and we work. But I think the key lens is how you message to a board, because everything else comes off of a subset of that, except for at staff level, which you might go into a little more detail, but like a constituent, a grant funder, general public, they're going to get an abbreviated message of that. So I always like to think about this. Be proactive, get out front on the boards. Secondly, during times of crisis, we should be over messaging. People get nervous, but they have their other lives to worry about. They can't remember where everything is at. We want to give them a sense of confidence that we're on top of things, even though it's crazy. And so you do that by messaging. The more quiet you are, that's not very good English. The more, conspiracy theories, all these things, people just start wondering. So really, really, really get out there. And I like this last one. In the short term, we're not changing anything, but in the short term, we're being smart. We're repositioning, we're realigning, we're moving and reacting. If you're in a sailboat and the wind changes, you got to move the sails around, and that's what we do here. So simply put, it's okay to do less mission right now to favor keeping the organization as strong a place as possible. Okay. So, Deb, I wanted to open this up to the floor, and I might put you on the spot first. You know what I mean? Just thinking about yourself for some groups. Remember how in each of the parts we've talked about, funding has been, there isn't an organization out there that hasn't had their funding affected some way, shape, or form. And when you layer on that we're all been affected by the level of demand for our services going up and down, and it's had an impact on our capacity. Have we figured out to work remotely? We've had furloughs and determinations, we've had PPP funds, all these different things going back and forth. The only thing is, and I apologize for using all these acronyms and things, is the only thing I've learned, Deb, there's one fact right now. It's expect the unexpected. Because if I give you a plan today, by the time I go down the hallway and come back, things have changed. So you have to be nimble. So I would love to throw it out there. I've had some great conversations in the TAs with people around this. Anything that, you know, I can't believe this. This thing started about mid-March. It's now mid-July. So we're 4 full months into this and there. Anything that's caught anybody by surprise. I've had more positive surprises than negatives, if I could start that. And I am a guy's glass is half full. A lot of groups have figured it out how to pivot. We don't use the word take advantage, but we've figured out how to do it differently. So we are in a good position and even doing virtually. So any comments? Deb, do you want to start that?
Well, I actually want to go back for one moment to your communication slide. And one thing I want to say is you do want to think about your different audiences.
Very good.
You want all of your missions, your communications to be consistent though. I mean, the last thing you want to do is have a really deep, serious conversation with your board saying we're in deep trouble and then tell the public you're fine. So what the public gets is a slimmed down version, but it should be really consistent. And I just kind of want to emphasize that because you can really get hurt if you tell your board one thing and the public something else, or your board one thing and funders something else. Inevitably, it kind of gets out there. If we could go back to what you already had us on.
Okay, and you bring up a good part. The way to think of that is the theme, you know. Okay, another comment, please?
So I think one of the things that I wouldn't call this one a surprise, but that is increasingly concerning me is that this has really hit members in terms of reducing your unrestricted funding, which is core to your lobbying. And that's something that we're going to have to think about as a community going forward. You know that I'm funding Mark and Aaliyah to work with you on that. I think we really have to explore ways to raise that unrestricted funding so that you continue to have the dollars to lobby and to turn and deal with whatever is most important. That really continues to hit home for me. And the other, which is not strictly financial, is that we've got to figure out how to support you around management, given that a lot of staff are working at home with kids, that your whole managing strategy in some ways has to change. And we're actually going to be offering a webinar on that, well, on managing staff remotely in general on August 10th, which we haven't noticed yet. I do want to read Mary's chat comment out loud because I think it's an important strategy. She says, we have a funder that switched our restricted grant to unrestricted. And I think that's a really important point. I've heard from a number of people who reached out to funders and asked them to adapt their funding, even if they didn't have new funding, to let you deal with what was most critical to you, or to switch it to unrestricted, which then gets you the ability to lobby. So I thank you for putting that up, Mary. I think that's a really important point. Does anyone else want to put a comment in the chat or just speak up? You certainly don't have to use the chat box. And I've been trying to unmute all of you, but I think some of you have to do it at your end.
So, Ed, while we're waiting, Mary's comment is really important. We're going to see that in section 3 today. And what Mary did, and I know this is super oversimplification we'll do in section 3, but if you don't ask, nothing will change, you know. But you have to understand how you ask, because people can interpret like you're in trouble or something. You know what I mean? You have to be really thoughtful. And we're going to go through a little checklist in section 3 on that. Okay, I didn't see anybody else raise their hand.
I think we can go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next section, okay? But again, anybody can jump in at any point in time. These sections do sort of overlap each other. Okay, we're going to go operating reserves. This is the sections get a little bit heavy content. Please don't say slow down. I want to think about this. This is a key piece. Anybody who's been on the TAs, you know we've talked about this in almost all our individual discussions. Operating yours and using them. Just a couple of lead-in things, you know. Operating reserves, again, another fact of life. They usually are very hard to build up, and they're built up in small drips and drabs over many, many years, but they're very easy to blow out. You know, one of my favorite saying is an organization that fought to build up operating reserves over 30 years, in tough times, they can disappear in 30 weeks, you know? And so it's always that ratio. You know, unless you sell a building or something happens where you get a big chunk of money, they're hard fought, put away, but they can disappear very quickly. Okay, here are the 2 questions, when and how much. There's some articles up on the website on this, but you'll use this PowerPoint slide, and don't hesitate to reach out to me to get into this in more detail, okay? So first, a couple of facts of life. There is no simple answer. Gets very different for every organization, okay? So no two organizations are alike, and the conditions that we're reacting to are constantly changing around us. And the biggest problem with operating reserves, Deb, is if you could tell me that this thing was going to be over on September 22nd at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, all us accountants can get rolling. We can start modeling and doing things. We can start planning and all that. Because we don't know that end date, what seems like a really good decision now might not be down the road. So what that means is, I argue we got to be conservative in how we do this because we don't know where we're going, okay? Remember that we build up operating reserves for two main reasons, okay? It's unexpected short-term. The key word here is short-term downturns or glitches, you know? Like there's a lot of little ones that people dip into operating reserves. So Deb, a good example would be, let's say you're going along and for some reason, event insurance doubled this year. You know what I mean? And we can't figure, we got to buy it, and next year we'll figure out how to do it. So we had a swallow a $5,000 increase or something. Or we had a huge snowstorm in February and we had to delay our program 2 months, and that's going to hurt cash flow. But that's to help us to bridge those things. And you'll see that here. Everybody needs operating reserve. At home, you have a disaster fund, right? You know, something happens, you can fall back on it, 2, 3, 4 months, whatever that is. That's what this is, but it's all short term. This crisis is not short term. The other part is healthy organizations build up reserves because that's one, what they do. 2, that's the measure of being healthy. 3, crappy organizations don't have the ability to build up reserves. Strong organizations do. Okay, and my favorite one is that they're for one-time uses of investments, and not investments in marketable securities, in a new program, in acquiring another nonprofit, and doing some R&D, research and development. Okay, being able to have some capital. So how many nonprofits want to do more and they have no funds? You know what I mean? And to seed those kind of things so you can grow. So these are the 2 reasons we have these, okay? So when and how much? I want to tell you, I don't know. So what I do know is I fall back on these 2 things right here. What I do know is this crisis is not short term. And so we have to pivot here, that we're going to be in a, sort of a new norm or lower sources of funding or whatever we're struggling with right now. I know most groups don't look like they looked last year. And even the groups that are starting out, because a couple of TAs, Deb, have been okay because of timing, but they're, that next round of funding is going to show up post-crisis, not pre-crisis, And so we gotta be able to pivot and understand we're going to be in a smaller spot. So what we have to do is through this, we have to, we must limit. There's some limits, of course, and we got to talk about the considerations behind the limits, plan, show how we're implementing it and how we're enforcing it. Okay. I want to tell you one thing. If you could end the webinar right now, Deb, there's one thing. A lot of people ostrich on operating reserves. They know they're dipping into them, but they don't let themselves just think about how much and for how long until the kitty runs dry, in that. And you can't do that, okay? And so we're going to talk about, there's a couple steps to this metering out. I've talked a little bit about before, remember in the earlier, that we're going to use it in bits and pieces at a time and how much. And it's really all about setting limits. I like the theme really is setting limits. I'm going to talk about the strategies, the rounds, and how we start to wean ourselves off of these through these rounds. And you'll see what I mean by the rounds, okay? So we have a systemic, thoughtful approach. We understand that when we message, and even outsiders is okay, that we are using some of our reserves to subsidize our current operations. Anytime you spend $1 out of reserves, it's a sort of a rough way to say it, but that's reality. Okay. But we want to do it not by accident. We want to do it in a planned way. It's one thing to say we're spending out of reserves and people go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. It's another thing to say we are blessed with X number of dollars of reserves this many months. Our plan is to set aside 2 months of it now, and this is what we're going to use. We're going to protect. And then they go, oh, you're thinking about it. okay, and how we implement that. So let's go through each of these steps. Define the strategies, okay? And in the strategy, we're looking at how we're going to make operating reserves available for use and what operating reserves we're going to held back for long-term for the future, okay? Remember the 0 and the 100% rule. Nobody's using 0, and we can't go anywhere near burning through all of it, okay? Okay, and then we're going to talk about the rounds, which is really important, you know, these stages that we have, and they're not 1 week at a time. And you'll see that in a minute. And then the weaning off is the third step. Okay, so here's 3 sections. I know this is a little crowded, Deb, so take a look at this, everybody. I just want you to see, I have 3 buckets here. I've divided groups into groups that have more than their operating reserve goal. So if you had a 12-month operating reserve goal and you're sitting above 12 months worth of operating reserves, you would be in the top line. At your reserve goal, if you had a 6-month goal or a 12-month goal and your reserves are sitting around, so you have 5.5, 6, 7 months, you're right around your goal. And then there's a lot of groups that don't have reserves put away or they're well below. If you have a reserve goal of 6 months, and you're sitting on 1 month, you would be down in this bucket. And can you see how I'm using less and less reserves, percent of the reserves, as you get weaker? That's a really good. Groups that have way above their target can afford to spend more, you know, out of it. And so these are my set. These are not factual, but you use them as a benchmark, and you'll see this in the case studies in a few minutes. Okay. Now, come down here, what are we protecting for long-term and what are, you know, for the future? So notice how these all add up to 100%. Can everybody see that? Deb, is this clear? I can see you. That if you're going to use 40%, it's going to leave 60% for the future. And if you're going to use 25% in the next year or so, it leaves 75% left over. And if you have a very small reserve, you can't really use much of it, because you got to keep most of it there. Because if you're at 1 or 2 months when you're supposed to be at 6 months, you know, if you blow, it's gone. You know, I mean, basically you shouldn't be touching it at all. So does this make sense? Deb, can you tell me if there's any questions here, any comments?
We have no questions or comments.
Yeah,
oh, we're good.
I think about this a lot, and this comes out of a lot of discussions with a lot of groups, okay? Now you'll see how this comes into play here as we go through. The rounds are the next most important thing. We're going to take this. Remember, we did the rolling budgets. We've been doing on the TAs. It's going to be 1 quarter at a time and stay on natural quarters. Okay. Fiscal year end sort of doesn't matter right now. We're fighting quarter to quarter, right? We're literally, it's like trying to fight our way into the middle of the city. We're taking it 1 neighborhood at a time. That's each of these quarters. Okay. Okay. So when we come into round 1, these percentages have nothing to do with the percentages I showed you before. Let's go back to the strong position. If you were to make 40% of your reserves available in round 1, which could have been April, May, June, you know, because we already got a full quarter, you would take 60 of that 40%, and you'll see this as an example. And then in the next round, the July, August, and September, you're starting to wean yourself off on the reliance of operating reserves. Okay, so then you would use 30% of that 40, and you'll see the numbers in a minute. And then in the last round, which would be October, November, December, we're barely using any operating reserves. We're slowly moving the organization to be self-balanced. So that what's left over is that 60% or that 90%, okay? I'm not trying to do too much math. I'm not good with math. I'm good with programs. But does this make sense? And you'll see this in an example. Yeah.
It does, but Mike, let's talk for just a moment about what it means to wean yourself off. Essentially, as I see it, weaning yourself off means some combination, depending on your opportunities, of increasing new funding by talking to people. You know, this is a crisis. It matters to people in our community, and trying to raise new funding to replace what you've lost, or reducing costs, which in this particular crisis could be anything from reducing payroll to maybe ending your lease because we're all working fine from home. Is that, tell me where if I've got that right.
I want to hear from other people, but the other way of saying what Deb said is you're slowly balancing your budget. Okay. And that in the beginning, things happen really fast. That's why we have reserves, because we can only pivot so fast, right? You know what I mean? Something gets taken away, but you're slowly getting to the point where, based on either increased revenues that you can bring in or lowering expenses, cost containment, you're slowly moving towards balancing the budget and not relying on any subsidy. And I like using that word because I think people get a picture in their mind, a subsidy from operating reserves. Because no operating reserve can subsidize a budget forever. And long-term is more than 6 months. Okay, so just a couple of restatements here. We must leave some level of operating reserves for when we come out of the back end of this thing. Don't take my 60% as gospel or my 75 or 90%, but I think you should feel in agreement with me that if you have less reserves, you have to leave more of them for the future. But if you have a ton of reserves, you can use more of them and still have good reserves for the future. You see what I mean? So, and this weaning off comes out of this. And be careful of this word right down here, true recovery. We've already seen in some jurisdictions real bounces where people have had to go back and shut down the economy again and stuff already. And I think we're going to go through this again when all the school systems have to make their decisions, right, Deb? It's going to have a real ripple effect. It's going to just be like a hurricane, whether a school system opens or closes,
And
Okay.
colleges, I think we're going to see big ripples in communities with universities and colleges.
Yeah, and they're huge employers too. Huge. I mean, you know how many people work at a university that has 35,000 people on campus? That's students. It's gigantic. Yeah. So for sustainability and continuity purposes, we got to keep some operating reserves for the future. Long-term is key. And you can see how I did the 60-40 rule down here. Okay. So let's go look at a couple of case studies. Now, there's a lot up here. I really want to hear from people because I'm getting tired of talking to myself. So take a look at this. I will tell you, Kate, we're going to go through 3 of these. The first one is the most opportunistic, i.e. the group has extra reserves and all that. And the last one will be a group that has very little reserves. But I wanted to have 3 different scenarios. I just want to see your comment on these. So in the case study number 1 up here, you'll see that they're looking at, they're a membership-based nonprofit. They're still C3. They're a long history. Their budget is $7.2 million, okay? Their operating reserve goal is 12 months, okay? And their actual reserves are sitting at 20 months. So 20 months of this, if you took this divided by 12, by 20, it would be, they're sitting on $12 million of liquid operating reserves, okay? The crisis is impacting their events. Their event revenue is less and their membership dues somewhat. The board is highly engaged, okay? So let's take a look. It's determined down here under the facts that they expect their event revenue will be down 50% long-term because they do a lot, and they're trying to figure out how to pivot to virtual and what that will impact. And they actually had a conference in April canceled, okay? Did I say cancel? Postpone, sorry. Conference, yeah, okay. So the board did the percentages I said before. Because they're overfunded, they chose to make 40% available over the 3 rounds, the 9 months. You see how it plays out, the 60, 30, 10, and that by the 4th round, I love the optics of actually showing the board where it's 0. You know what I mean? Because they could see. Because if you're not projecting forward, all they're seeing is you're taking 2.9 million out. You know what I mean? Because it's big numbers. But you see it's down to 0 in round 4 in January 2021. Okay, notice my little bit of comments on the lines. In round 1, you're just repositioning programs as fast as you can because, crap was happening, remember? And then we start to complete our cost containment here, and they're starting to move towards virtual programs. They still need reserves to help. And they're trying to get almost balanced in the 3rd round. Okay, in the quarter October to December. Okay, any comments? Am I allowed to call on somebody? No.
Sure.
No, I don't want to embarrass anybody. But any comments, please jump in there. It's just us people.
Right.
Does this help to see a picture? It helps me. I've done, this still came from an example of a client I had. We did exactly this.
John, did you want to say something?
Yeah, well, I would just say that it does help seeing this kind of laid out and broken down. And I have really not given a lot of thought to the idea of rounds of kind of stair-stepped down funding.
I like that stair step, John. That's really a good analogy. Really good. And let people know where the bottom of the stairs are, you know? Because when you just say, imagine you couldn't see 2, 3, and 4, John, that would look like a scary number, right?
Yeah, it's kind of that Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade step out into the.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
right. Leap of faith. Yep, good. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one. Okay, Deb?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, case study number 2. Remember, this is a little bit of a, I'm going to use John's analogy, stepping down the stairs a little bit. Smaller organization. This one is grant-based. Budget of $3.6 million. I did this because everything's a multiple of 12. It kept the math simple, okay? 3.6 million. Operating reserve goal is only 6 months now, okay? They're sitting on operating reserves of 5 months. 6 months or half a year's operating reserve would be $1.8 million, right? If you take 3.6 divided by 12, it's 300,000 a month. So 300,000 times 5, 1.5 million. That's their goal, okay? The goal is 6 months. I'm sorry, it's 1.8 million. They're sitting on 5 months. So I would think of a group like this, John, everybody else, that they're like around their goal. You're never exactly at your goal. So if you're 1 month above or 1 month below, you know, I would keep that there. So you see where I'm going at here. Okay, and then you'll see some general comments here. The crisis impacts is on their new grants. This organization relies on grants a lot, but they're constantly having to go out and find new grants, okay? You will see that. Also, this organization, unlike the first one, their gala is scheduled late in the year, where the first one had an event that was early in the year. So Deb, you see how I keep moving all the pieces around the table.
Yeah.
And this is my favorite one right here. Current funding is okay. There's a lot of groups just because of the way they were positioned. I have talked to so many groups that, thank God, they kept saying, yeah, we got all our money in February. We're in okay. But they got to start thinking about what's going to happen next February, next December. You know what I mean? Really important. So the board is mostly, you know, disengaged because right now they're not hurting. And, you know, and a lot of boards are like that. So it just means that the staff could do nothing and they could be in trouble real quick, right? Okay, so grant funding, current okay. Expect 2020 cut in grant funding, down 50%. And May gala postponed, donations and such. So I have a real mixture here of things going on, okay? So board approved operating reserves usage is 25% this time. So I'm doing that middle bucket where they're near their reserve goal, but not sitting on a ton. So that means they only got 375,000 to use. Okay, and if they do the step down, thank you, John. Okay, weaning off. Step down sounds much better than weaning off. Okay, step down. You can see how the numbers play out, and here's some of the strategy that they're using. Okay. Any comments? Again, I love the 4-round look. Even though the numbers are much smaller, it gives an insightful look. Now we'll have to adjust as things go along. Anybody have any comments on this one?
Mary, did you want to talk?
No.
I can't.
You're unmuted, so I thought maybe you did. Um,
Oh,
Any comments? John, what do you think? Anything different here?
Well, I was going to say this. This is kind of. It feels a little bit like Kansas Action for Children, to be honest, in terms of funding. Okay, and even kind of looking into next year, funding looks good, and we're a smaller sized budget, so like it's we don't have actually any events really that we rely on, but it's nice to kind of see myself mostly in this so far. Of course, I haven't seen the next case study and how many more there are. Yeah.
So this group is actually, John, you made up a couple of points. They're sort of diversified in a couple of different ways, and when it happens during the year, and different types of funding. really broadly. It's a nice mix between contributions, grants, and programs, okay? And we'll see. But the key with this one to me was they're currently okay, but looking ahead. Okay, I'm going to go to case study.
Hang on 1 second. Jennifer, did you want to say something? Because you unmuted.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to kind of say something similar to John.
And then this one kind of looks like us too. And, kind of what I like about these case studies and the stepping down is it just gives you a little bit of time to actually to prepare your board that, while you're stepping down, that probably means you're making some budget cuts to get to a balanced budget. So you can put yourself in a position to, to wean yourself off of the reserve fund.
Good, perfect.
I do want to say one thing, Mike, that you and I talked about before the webinar started, which is we do think you need to make your income assumptions the safe assumptions. And we talked about this in the context of, do you expect gala funding in 2021 or 2022? Our recommendation, certainly mine, is you start with a safe income. So if you usually have event funding and you're not sure you're going to be able to do your event, and you haven't yet explored how to do online effectively, you budget without it and you tell your board you're doing that to be conservative. Doesn't mean you're giving up on event funding. You still will try and make a virtual event work. If the pandemic is suddenly a lot safer in your state as you approach the time you would hold an in-person event, and you really think people will turn up, you can go ahead and do it, but you don't put that in your budget assumptions. You start with the safe budget assumptions and make sure that you can survive at that level, and then you try and go from there. We particularly were talking about events and the fact that even if you can do a live event, it's sort of the last, 20% of your participants where a lot of the money comes from, because there's the costs in putting it on and getting sponsors and whatever. And so you really want to have robust attendance to make it worthwhile to do a live event. And so you don't want to plan for an event as an essential portion of your budget. Doesn't mean you give up on it, but you plan only on the safe funding sources you've got. So I thought that was an important point we talked about earlier, Mike, and I wanted to.
Good. No, it really, really is important. And in the next two sections too, John brought up a good point. It's good to compare and contrast these three case studies. Let's look at case study number 3. So we have a CBO, community-based organization, smaller budget size, 1.2 million. That means their burn rate's 100,000 a month. Their operating reserve goal, you'll see here, is 3 months, which is on the low side. Remember, it's the low side of acceptable. And they're actually sitting on operating, I was nice at 2 months. I have a lot of I started to do this one with -2 months, but they're below. And remember, a more stable goal would be towards 6 months, so they would be substantially below, but that's where they're at, okay? They're worried, they have an older $400,000 grant. What I mean by older, you know how no grant lasts forever? So we've all been with organizations where you get a grant that's 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, eventually it's going to go away and they're going to grant to somebody else. And so they have an older grant that's not going to be renewing, and they know about that even before the crisis, okay? Expect other donations and grants will be down 25%. The board is mostly social workers focused on serving the community. I just say that, and you can see they will probably have a lot of in-kind volunteers working and things. So take a look at the math here, okay? Current grant funding is okay, but they already know this $400,000 grant's gone. If they're gonna lose 50% of 25% of the rest of the budget, so to speak, their funding is going to be down $600,000. The $400,000 grant and 25% of the $800,000 remaining. That equals $600,000. Deb, everybody okay with how I came up with that $600,000 down? Everybody see that? It's a pretty shocking number here. I should finish. You know what, Deb? Next time I better reverse these case studies. We should finish with the best one and not the worst one. I'm not trying to get people.
No, this is what you're helping us all learn to avoid. I think we're fine ending with it.
Okay.
No, we have no comments.
But okay, good. So you see, so that's pretty shocking. And so look at the numbers, even though we have to, because we only have 2 months, we got to make sure 90% of it stays away. So 10% of 200,000 is only 20K. And it's really not very much. Now they're going to use, because they're in the grant, which is, I wanted to tell people, they're actually using, there are PPP funds now. They can do it over 24 weeks. Well, they'll use most of those in this middle bucket, July to September. Okay, and you can see the thinking here. Okay, but not very many dollars here and such. Again, I like the 4 rounds. Even in worst case scenarios, I always want people to look out and see what it looks like. And then the thought process. And you notice that there's a little bit of a thought process for each of these rounds. Okay, any other comments? Jennifer, John, anybody on top of what you said before? Each of these situations are really different, but they sort of play out. We could do 20 more, but I like the balance of these. I think it paints a picture.
Yeah, no comments. We're good.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on because we have 2 more sections. Okay, I want to talk about managing restricted funds during this disruptive time period we're in now. Okay, so when economic conditions change quickly, I always assume that we have to be careful with restricted funding because sometimes we can accidentally be dipping into it, especially groups that are short on cash. You know what I mean? Because you might not have the unrestricted funds to use. So we got to be careful we're not in a disadvantage or in a position that we didn't realize. There are 2 pressure points to consider, which is aligning, the changing demand and capacity that this COVID crisis is forcing on us, and the risk of inadvertently using restricted funds for purposes other than what the donors have said to us for. Okay, quick statement. Fact number 1, if they're clearly restricted, you cannot use them for another purpose arbitrarily, okay? And I just want to put that up there. But there are things around grant funds I do want people to take a look at, okay? And sometimes things end up in restricted buckets because that's traditional where they've gone, or they assume that's where donors wanted it. So I do want to go back through and talk through a number of steps that can happen here. And this is a 3-step proactive approach on looking at restricted funds, okay? Step 1, it never hurts to go back and take a look at it. I mean, you have a grant to buy books for the library, that's what it is. You know what I mean? But double check and reword, because if by some chance this step 1 doesn't cost you anything, we might be able to find some little wiggle room there. I like to think about prioritizing the use of restricted funds and get those funds and use those and hold back on using unrestricted funds wherever we can in a crisis. And then we're going to reach out to the restricted fund sources, is what Mary talked about earlier. So just to go into these a little bit, step 1, being fully really knowledgeable. I can't tell you how many times when we've gone in and looked with organizations that over 100-year history, we've gone in and actually found things in the file and stuff of where funds that were restricted where actually weren't, or there was something, and there might be some room for interpretations. Something that started 10, 15 years ago, Deb, I cannot tell you how many times I've seen this, where an organization was really healthy back then, and they just said, we get these funds in for this program, it's always going to be held to buy books and never anything else. But that was just an overinterpretation back then. You know what I mean? It's just something that happens. You see this all the time in churches. Oh, the appeal we do around Easter is always used for this, but it's never mentioned anywhere. You know what I mean? It never said anywhere that the Easter appeal at the church always had to be used for Sunday school. But somewhere 20 years ago, people started saying that. You know what I mean? So you just have to look at that.
Can I add a comment there? You also want to be thoughtful in advance if you're doing a restricted funding drive. And I'm going to give you an example from when I sat on the board of a local nonprofit youth theater camp, and one of our buses died unexpectedly and we had to raise money for it. We were careful to make it clear in our language that if we raised more money than we needed to replace that bus, we would replace another bus in our aging fleet. And that just gave us a lot more flexibility. And people were still really committed to replacing the first bus. And we did in fact go over our initial campaign. So you want to be careful if you're doing a funding drive that you, even if it's for an immediate urgent need, that you're thoughtful about how you word the ask so that you can go a little more expansive. And this is a great time to be thinking about that, because many of you may want to do one-time expanded fundraising drives to support your advocacy for families at both the federal and the state and sometimes the local level during COVID. You know, try and word it so that you tell them the kinds of things you'll use it like, but you make it clear that it might be broader because there are so many needs during this pandemic.
Remember, restrictions are really tight. If you put out an appeals letter that says, please donate, we're going to use most of these funds to buy a bus and to support our other efforts, that's totally 100% unrestricted. If you put out an appeals letter that says, please support us, we need to use this funds for buses and for Sunday school, that's 100% unrestricted because it's two choices. But if you put out an appeals letter that says, please support, we're going to buy buses with this money, that's restricted. Okay, don't blow off the second bullet point here, time restrictions. That can oftentimes be as well easier to manage because, you know, you get a grant for 24 months, but they don't say you have to spend 50% of it in the first 2 months or whatever. You know what I mean? We'll communicate, maybe there's some timing issues here, and you'll see that in the case study we're going to get to. Prioritize using restricted funds first. If you can, doing programs is good. Restricted funds hopefully will line up with some of your key programs. Try to spend out those restricted funds for a number of reasons, all obvious. You were saving unrestricted. You can go back for more, and you're doing key programming. Okay, so that's step number 3 is talking to and communicating with the grant source. Got to be careful here. Don't want to give them the wrong impression. But communications generally are good, so you want to think about that and talk about. And you want to, you know, and I've seen more than amazing stories here, Deb, where people have gone in and asked for outright releases of funds, what Mary talked about. You never know what the possibility is. Even if there's just a broadening of the restrictions, what this talks about here, you know, or extra time is given, you know, a no-cost extension. There's a lot of things that can have a ripple effect at your organization that are huge, okay? So again, the time restrictions here, talk to them about extensions. You'll see this in the case study in a minute. Grant donors who make, you know, are still your best supporters. They know what you're doing. Maybe it's really not a good strategy to ask them to change the restrictions, but maybe they will give additional funds. You know what I mean? And so, you know, all these things are on the table. No two situations and timing, be very thoughtful, think about it, but reach out early. People appreciate that. You know, even I'm also, Deb, of the kind to say, hey, right now we don't need anything, but we want to just keep you informed. You know, we could come back and ask for a no-cost extension, an extra 6 months. We could maybe ask for a little lightening to help support a program or something. Okay?
Yeah, I'm going to actually flag one thing that all of you might have grants on, which is the census timeline extended. That's a perfect reason to go back and ask for a no-cost extension on your grant so you can keep working through the end of the census.
Yeah. So my planning tips, I'm just looking down. We only got about 10, 12 minutes left. Steps, make steps 1 and 2 a priority because they're mechanical. And then when you go to step 3, that gets very personal. Okay? Because steps 1 and 2 are internal. So share the information directly with your sources. This is where your relationship is. Okay? There's so many grantors I've talked to over time have just said to me, and it just kills me, Deb, if they just would have reached out and talked to us, we could have done this. You know what I mean? When something didn't go. So many times. It's just amazing, you know? Okay, example cases. Example number 1, take a quick read of this. Okay. Oops, sorry. During the crisis, a program covered by restricted funds donations had to be suspended due to social distancing. A request was put forth to the donor to extend the expiration by 1 year so the program could be rescheduled for a future date. Okay. Any comments on this? Seems pretty boring, right? Sorry. Any comments on this? This to me is huge. It helps out on cash flow, right? because we could have those funds. We might, it's okay. A lot of people will dip into them temporarily, but we'll be able to see them back, and so if we can get, we might not have the staff might have been furloughed or something, This is a simple one, but a lot of people don't take advantage of this. Anybody comment?
Also, in this case, I might also think about asking them to allow you to restructure the program to virtual or something, because who knows when we'll be done with social distancing.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Number 2 goes in a little bit different direction, a little bit more detail here. An organization had grant funding that were expected within 3 months for a specific research project. The grantor was contacted, asked for an additional 3 months time. Okay. This we've done a lot. The staff labor costs, you can't double dip on the CARES Act, the paycheck protection money. Okay, so if people are being supported by a grant that's running out soon, we got to use those funds first. Remember, I always said use your restricted funds first. But because of the CARES Act expanded from 8 to 24 weeks now, we're able to sort of visualize and slot these things. Remember when the Paycheck Protection Program came out, it was 8 weeks in the beginning, and we only had till the end of June. We were going the other way. We were trying to get all these grants that were expiring in June if they could push out to the summer. Okay. Any comments here just to see this? I just wanted to think about this. And any comments on any of these reaching out to the restricted fund sources? I'm always learning for how people have talked and communicated with their donors, grantors, sponsors, any partners.
The other thing I would just flag for you is that there are processes for restricted funding that came in people's wills, and that's more complicated. And you need to talk to a lawyer, but it doesn't mean it's undoable.
Yeah, no, and oftentimes some of these wills, people will make planned gifts early on in their, I've seen them in their 40s and 50s. And so those wills can change and things on the ground will change, and you need to be proactive with them. Okay, last section, just gonna spend a few minutes on this section. And I was whining to Deb when we first got on the phone here. We're already, the first full quarter of COVID-19 is behind us, the April, May, June. And there's a lot, and what drove this section was there's a lot of nonprofits that have June 30 year ends, okay? And so we just wanted to think about this because you still got to do 990s and your reports, but I'm against sort of this melded, how did it come out for the year? It's really a 2-step process. So the pandemic and the company crisis is forcing nonprofits to change their thinking about things and reporting. I think this is really important, okay? And I think, the crisis will cause a somewhat temporary moving away from just annual. It's always like, how do we do for the year? How do we do for the year? And that's super important. But for a little while, it's going to be, how did we do for the quarter? How did we do? Because if you're a June year end, okay, I want to talk about this, that at June 30 year ends right here, you had 8.5 months, right? Started mid-March is about where the shutdown started to happen. 8.5 months of great, it was a great economy. Things were going great back then. And then we have 3.5 months of the door slamming. But if you're at 12/31, it's the opposite. You're going to only have a couple of months of good activity, and then most of the year is going to be in this, okay? Then you have situations where you might be front-end loaded or back-end loaded. Front-end loaded means that June 30 year end that has their biggest programs early in the year was in great shape. A June 30 year end that had the biggest program in the end of the year, they're horrible shape because the end of this year was no time to move that event. But 12/31s that are back-end loaded for the biggest event, which is happening in November, they have plenty of time to try to reposition or do something with that event. But that June 30 year end that had an event in the end of April didn't have time to do that. And so many of our 12/31 year ends, we're sitting and seeing what other groups have done and figuring out how to do it. So I'm just want everybody to think about this a little bit, okay? And I think there's 2 takeaways here. Recognize that a 12-month melded, that's going to come out on a 990 audit report, but it gives you no story. Does that make sense, Deb? No story of 12 months melded. You know what I mean? Because how the door slammed. So you got to realize, using the June 30 as an example, it's 8.5 months of super strong results wiped out by a few months of a weaker number. Okay. So I want to pivot to showing the results, internally. This doesn't show up on an audit or a 990, that you should be reporting. Like, this is how we did for the first 9 months and how we did for the last 3 months and such. And if you're 1231, how we did, and compare, and just think about split reporting for a little while, the bottom line, until we can start to see where we can start to forecast and plan for the future. Okay. One last thing I want to talk about, and I know a lot of people don't do these things, but it's big to me. I've done it my whole career, and I've never been an auditor or a tax preparer. I'm always sitting alongside the controllers, the CFO, and all that. It's putting together a finance memo that goes with the financial reports that documents what happened. And I believe during this crisis, we really need to do this, and at least do them on a quarterly basis, not maybe every month. The story, how the quarter unfolded, is more relevant almost than the numbers. You got to let people know that, depending on which state you're in, or where things started shutting down, where your major events happened. Keep the memo short, but do it. This is very important, to do it in chronological order so people see, because there were decisions that we made that we completely reversed. The best one that comes to my mind, Deb, is when the 8-week PPP funds was extended to 24 weeks. All of a sudden, we had to completely flip our decision-making, how to use those funds, literally overnight. You know what I mean? We had about a week between the time the House passed the bill and it went to the Senate and then the president for signing. You know what I mean? But we really had to move quickly. Highlight and just stay 3 or 4 things. I never like to do more. The key challenge, what happened, how it affected you, and all that, and tie into the challenges of the overall impact. And here's where I get a little bit cutesy, but I love using themes in my report, and pick one out. I've used all of these multiple times. How we pivoted, responding to the unexpected, uncharted waters, because this is a nice way to put in there that this was a very difficult time to plan and make decisions without whining. So it looks bad to say, well, we didn't know what was going on. How do you expect us to make a decision? All I kept saying is, I just keep repeating one of these, during this unexpected time, during the uncharted waters period, no precedent. So I like using themes. They paint a vivid picture, and the themes add context to the explanation, But it's never too early to start thinking about how that year-end messaging is going to go. Because remember, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, you're going to have to refer back for comparison purposes what happened back then. And believe it or not, I'm expecting that. I'm never going to say we made wrong decisions, because we don't know. You know what I mean? But I want to say we made thoughtful decisions, and it might have played out differently. Okay? And so that brings the end of the 4 parts here. We're right at 3 o'clock Eastern time. I'm happy to stay on. I think the 4 parts, if you put them together, really give you a nice sort of roadmap financially to help get through the crisis. I look forward to working with everybody on TAs and continuing and such. I'll throw it back to you, Deb.
So I do want to see if anybody has any final comments or questions. And while you're either typing in the chat or unmuting yourself, I also want to say that we do have some room in the budget. If you've been meeting with Mike and found it helpful and would like to meet with him again, just shoot me an email or send Polani an email, and we will approve that. Our top priority as an organization at the partnership is getting you guys through this crisis so you can keep doing effective advocacy for kids. So if Mike can help you get there, we're happy to pay for him to do that. John, you have a question or a comment?
Well, it feels a little bit like discussing your family finances with everybody around watching. But I have a question about the kind of interplay between operating reserves and endowments, because KAC is in a position, because of somebody's large gift several years ago, we have both an endowment and are trying to build up the operating reserve, and wondering if perhaps it's an offline conversation about the interplay between those, or the rules for one and how they are different for another in terms of when to use and why to use.
Yeah, I'd love to talk with you about it, John. Endowments are a real fact of life. We haven't directly addressed them because it's either there's groups that have them and obviously groups that don't. Okay, and a lot of things around endowments are the same core principles around restricted funds. They're just super restricted. Of course, there's, every year we go to the courts 2, 3, 4 times a year to get some endowments moved out for different reasons. But also I've been very successful working with groups where sometimes some money got into endowment, they're really quasi endowment. So there's a lot of things to consider there, And so we can do that either in a TA or catch me offline. Okay?
Yeah, I'll connect with Deb about it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, it's
Really good question.
it's a really important thing to keep in mind. People gave you that money so you'd be around to do good work, and that may be why you need it right now. Jennifer's comment is, thank you, appreciate the suggestion on the finance memo. Mike has been very helpful. Mike, would it be useful to send around a model finance memo for people?
Oh, they're all really different. They're all personal.
Are there like a set of bullet points for what should be included?
Yeah, I really, I could probably end up fiddling with you, Deb, on something. You know what I mean? Go back one that I'd have to clean up, But
Yeah,
I think I really notice how I had 3 slides on the finance memo here. I follow these bullet points religiously. I am not a nuts and bolts accountant, where I'm doing the financial statements, but almost all my clients, they always say, Mike, can you write our finance memo? You always write the best one, because I'm trying to bridge the numbers side, with the story,
right.
and a lot of accountants can't write, they don't know how to tell the story. So I'm there to help you work through it. Yeah, I'm just going through my mind real quick. Every time I do one of these, there's no 2 that look alike, and I never use a template. I start writing because like no 2 people are alike. If I had to, tell Deb's, you wanted me to write your biography, Deb, I'm not gonna,
Right.
there's a template for that. Because people can tell. I hate plug and play. You know what plug and play is?
Yeah,
The financial report, you change the date, put the new numbers in, put it out. People do that with finance memos, and you see them all the time. I've seen them in the TAs. It's the same report. Bookkeeper shoves in a few numbers. It doesn't tell a story. So I like mine in a paragraph. But I could probably pull one that I like and I have to just vanillaize it a little bit, so nobody knows who it is.
yeah. I think that would be a really helpful short piece to circulate to everybody. Let's
Sure.
talk about that offline. Anyone else have any final comments or questions for Mike before we close this out?
Okay.
All right. Thank you all for joining us. We will send the recording. You should already have the slides. And, if you guys also see a topic that you'd like Mike to do another webinar on, let us know. We'll see if we can set it up. It is really important to me to make sure that you guys get the financial and accounting support that you need during this period. John, you want to say something?
I was just going to say thank you very much for organizing this.
Oh, it's what we're here for. Have a great rest of the day. Hang in there during this interminably long, stressful period, and I hope this helped take a little bit of the stress off of you all. And thank you so much, Mike, for doing all of these.
Okay. Thank you.
Have a great day. I'm going to end the recording now.